March 8, 1945. A bunker complex beneath the Reichstag in Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sits across from Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, as they review damage reports that have been flooding in from across the Reich. The papers spread before them tell a story so devastating that Keitel initially refuses to believe the calculations. His aide, a young major who has spent the last 6 months compiling data from every Gauleiter, every city administrator, and every factory director still able to communicate with Berlin, repeats the numbers with a trembling voice. Over the past 3 years, American bombers alone have delivered approximately 2.7 million tons of high explosives and incendiaries onto German soil. This figure excludes British operations entirely. Keitel stares at the document for nearly a full minute before speaking, and when he finally does, his words emerge as barely more than a whisper. We calculated they could not sustain such operations. We were told their industrial capacity was exaggerated. How did we not see this coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The question hangs in the air like the smoke that perpetually drifts over Berlin's ruins, unanswered because the truth is too uncomfortable to articulate. German military intelligence had failed at the most fundamental level, not through lack of diligence or competence, but through a systematic underestimation of American industrial might that bordered on willful blindness. The numbers Keitel now confronted represented not merely explosive tonnage, but a complete miscalculation of American capacity to project power across an ocean, sustain operations on an unprecedented scale, and maintain a tempo of destruction that German planners had deemed logistically impossible. The American bombing campaign against Germany had begun modestly enough in 1942, with relatively small raids that German air defenses handled with confidence. The first American daylight raid on German soil occurred on January 27, 1943. When approximately 90 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the port city of Wilhelmshaven. German fighter pilots and anti-aircraft crews had celebrated this engagement as a decisive victory, claiming to have shot down nearly half the attacking force while sustaining minimal damage to the target area. Intelligence reports filed after the Wilhelmshaven raid concluded that American bombers were vulnerable to coordinated fighter attacks and that their much-vaunted precision bombing capabilities were vastly overstated. These assessments flowed upward through Wehrmacht command structures where they were received with satisfaction by senior officers who had long maintained that American military effectiveness was a product of propaganda rather than genuine capability. The German High Command's understanding of American air power in early 1943 was shaped by several deeply flawed assumptions that would prove catastrophic as the war progressed. First among these was the belief that American industrial production, while impressive in raw numbers, lacked the sophistication necessary to produce military equipment capable of matching German engineering standards. This assumption was rooted in decades of German technical education that emphasized precision manufacturing and theoretical excellence, creating a professional culture that viewed mass production as inherently inferior to craftsmanship. German officers who had toured American automobile factories in the 1930s returned with reports describing assembly line methods that produced vehicles quickly but supposedly sacrificed quality for quantity. These observations, valid perhaps in the context of civilian manufacturing, were extrapolated to military production with results that would prove disastrous. The second major assumption concerned logistics and sustainability. German planners calculated that American forces would face insurmountable challenges in projecting power across the Atlantic Ocean while simultaneously supporting operations in the Pacific theater against Japan. The distances involved seemed to preclude sustained heavy bomber operations, particularly given the fuel consumption rates of four-engine bombers and the limited capacity of forward bases in England. German intelligence estimated that American forces might sustain raid frequencies of perhaps twice weekly at most, with monthly tonnages unlikely to exceed 10,000 tons even under optimal conditions. These calculations were based on German understanding of logistical constraints and assumed that American supply chains would function no more efficiently than German systems operating at peak performance. The third assumption proved perhaps most damaging of all. German military leadership believed that their fighter defenses and anti-aircraft systems would impose casualties on American bomber formations at rates sufficient to render sustained operations prohibitively expensive in both equipment and trained personnel. The Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated tactical doctrines for intercepting heavy bomber formations, and German anti-aircraft artillery had achieved levels of accuracy and concentration that made them genuinely formidable defensive weapons. When combined with the advantages of interior lines of communication and the ability to concentrate defending forces at threatened points, German planners concluded that they possessed the capability to bleed American air forces to the point of operational ineffectiveness within months of sustained operations. These assumptions were not entirely without foundation. The initial American raids did suffer significant casualties, and German fighter pilots achieved impressive kill ratios against bomber formations that had not yet perfected their defensive tactics. The problem was that German planners had fundamentally miscalculated the scale at which American forces would operate and the speed at which American industry could replace losses that would have crippled any European air force. The reality of American productive capacity began revealing itself gradually through 1943 as raid frequencies increased beyond what German intelligence had predicted possible. By summer, American bomber groups were mounting operations several times weekly, and the size of individual raids was growing from dozens of aircraft to hundreds. German fighter squadrons found themselves scrambling to intercept bomber streams that seemed to stretch across the horizon, escorted by increasing numbers of P-47 Thunderbolt fighters that extended protective cover deeper into German airspace than defenders had believed possible. The ammunition expenditure required to engage these massive formations began straining German logistics, while the fuel consumption of defending fighters started creating shortages that limited training for replacement pilots. Still, German command remained confident that the defensive system could adapt and that American losses would eventually force a reduction in operational tempo. This confidence persisted even as evidence mounted that something unprecedented was occurring in the skies over the Reich. Intelligence officers analyzing wreckage from shot-down American bombers discovered serial numbers that told a disturbing story about American production rates. The B-17 Flying Fortress bombers appearing over Germany carried sequential production numbers that indicated American factories were completing dozens of these complex four-engine aircraft weekly. Each B-17 required approximately 400,000 separate parts, used 13,000 pounds of aluminum, and represented 30,000 man-hours of labor. Yet American production lines were turning them out faster than German factories could produce the much simpler Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter. Similar patterns emerged from examination of P-51 Mustang fighters, which began appearing in large numbers by early 1944. The P-51 represented a quantum leap in escort fighter capability, with range sufficient to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and performance characteristics that matched or exceeded the best German fighters. The appearance of P-51s and squadron strength might have been dismissed as deployment of a limited number of specialized aircraft, but intelligence reports soon documented hundreds of these fighters operating simultaneously, suggesting production on a scale that German planners had deemed impossible. The logistical achievement supporting these operations was equally staggering. Each heavy bomber mission required not just aircraft, but enormous quantities of aviation fuel, bombs, ammunition, spare parts, and all the other material necessary to keep a modern air force operational. A single 1,000-bomber raid, which American forces were mounting with increasing frequency by mid-1944, required approximately 6 million gallons of aviation fuel, 3,000 tons of bombs, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition for defensive machine guns. The fact that American forces could sustain such operations multiple times weekly while simultaneously supporting ground forces advancing across France and maintaining operations in the Pacific indicated a level of industrial mobilization that exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. German intelligence officers attempting to calculate American production capacity found themselves repeatedly revising their estimates upward as new evidence emerged. By late 1944, the most pessimistic German assessments suggested that American aircraft production might be running at rates 3 or 4 times higher than German output. Even these estimates proved conservative. The actual figures, which German intelligence never successfully determined during the war, showed American factories producing approximately 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, compared to German production of roughly 40,000 aircraft during the same period. This production differential translated directly into operational capability, as American losses that would have devastated any European air force were simply replaced within days or weeks, allowing operational tempo to continue unabated. The human dimension of this industrial achievement was equally impressive and equally underestimated by German intelligence. American training programs were producing aircrew at rates that seemed impossible given the technical complexity of operating heavy bombers and the coordination required for effective formation flying. Each B-17 crew consisted of 10 men, all requiring specialized training in their respective positions, from pilots and navigators to bombardiers and gunners. The training pipeline for producing combat-ready crews required approximately 1 year from recruitment to operational deployment, yet American training facilities were graduating thousands of qualified airmen monthly throughout 1943 and 1944. German intelligence officers who analyzed interrogations of captured American airmen were consistently surprised by the youth and relative inexperience of many crew members, leading to recurring underestimations of American training effectiveness. The assumption persisted that hastily trained American crews would prove less effective than veteran Luftwaffe personnel, an assumption that was technically correct on an individual basis but irrelevant given the overwhelming numerical advantages American forces enjoyed. The bombing campaign itself evolved through distinct phases that German defenses struggled to counter. Early raids targeted submarine pens, aircraft factories, and other military-industrial facilities deemed critical to German war production. These precision daylight raids reflected American doctrinal emphasis on destroying specific target sets rather than the area bombing favored by British forces during nighttime operations. The accuracy of American bombing improved dramatically as crews gained experience and as technological innovations like the Norden bombsight were refined through operational use. By 1944, American bomber groups were achieving hit rates that allowed genuine disruption of German production, particularly when raids were concentrated against specific industries or bottleneck facilities. The systematic targeting of German synthetic fuel production beginning in spring 1944 demonstrated the devastating potential of sustained precision bombing against carefully selected economic targets. German synthetic fuel plants, which provided the majority of aviation gasoline and diesel fuel for the Wehrmacht, proved vulnerable to precision bombing despite elaborate defenses. The hydrogenation facilities required to convert coal into liquid fuel were large, complex, and difficult to disperse or conceal. American intelligence had identified approximately 20 major synthetic fuel plants whose destruction would cripple German military mobility, and beginning in May 1944, these facilities became primary targets for sustained bombing campaigns. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The results exceeded even optimistic American predictions. German fuel production, which had reached 316,000 tons in March 1944, collapsed to just 107,000 tons by June and continued declining through the remainder of the year as American bombers returned repeatedly to smash repaired facilities. The impact of fuel shortages rippled through every aspect of German military operations. Luftwaffe fighter units, which required enormous quantities of high-octane aviation fuel for training and operations, found themselves increasingly grounded not by lack of aircraft or pilots but by simple absence of fuel. Panzer divisions on both eastern and western fronts received reduced fuel allocations that limited their mobility and forced them into defensive postures that negated their tactical advantages. Naval vessels remained in port, unable to conduct training exercises or operational patrols. The U-boat fleet, which had terrorized Allied shipping in the Atlantic, found its effectiveness drastically reduced as fuel shortages limited patrol durations and forced submarines to operate closer to home bases where Allied anti-submarine forces could concentrate their efforts. Even German civilian transportation ground to a halt as fuel allocations were diverted to military use, creating cascading economic disruptions that affected everything from food distribution to factory operations. This systematic destruction of German fuel production represented precision strategic bombing at its most effective, demonstrating that concentrated attacks against specific economic bottlenecks could achieve results impossible through general industrial destruction. The German response to the fuel crisis involved frantic efforts to repair damaged plants, disperse production facilities, and develop alternative fuel sources. These efforts consumed enormous resources and diverted skilled workers and engineers from other critical war production, yet achieved only limited success against the sustained American bombing campaign. Repair crews working around the clock could restore damaged facilities to partial operation within weeks, but American bombers returned with ruthless consistency to destroy the repairs before full production could resume. Efforts to disperse production into smaller facilities proved logistically impractical given the complexity of hydrogenation processes and the enormous utility requirements involved. Alternative fuel sources like methanol and wood gas were explored desperately, but these proved inadequate for military applications requiring high-performance fuels. The fuel crisis thus became a self-reinforcing catastrophe as German inability to adequately defend production facilities ensured continued vulnerability to attack, while reduced fuel availability limited the sortie rates of defending fighters, creating a death spiral that German planners proved unable to escape. The psychological impact of the bombing campaign on German military leadership was profound and multifaceted. Officers who had confidently predicted that American air power would prove ineffective found themselves confronting evidence of failure so comprehensive that it challenged their fundamental understanding of modern warfare. The sight of thousand-bomber raids streaming overhead in broad daylight, overwhelming defenses through sheer numerical superiority, forced recognition that Germany was fighting an opponent with resources on a scale beyond anything European military tradition had prepared them to comprehend. This realization produced various responses across different levels of command, from denial and minimization among true believers in German superiority to despair and defeatism among those who understood the implications of the production differential. Field Marshal Keitel's shocked reaction upon learning the cumulative tonnage of American bombing represented this broader crisis of understanding, as German officers struggled to reconcile their expectations of warfare as a contest of skill and valor with the reality of industrial warfare where material resources ultimately determined outcomes regardless of tactical proficiency or fighting spirit. The transformation of American bombing strategy through 1944 revealed dimensions of industrial warfare that German military doctrine had never adequately addressed. While Luftwaffe theorists had developed sophisticated concepts for tactical air support and operational level interdiction, they had fundamentally failed to grasp how strategic bombing could function as an independent instrument of national power capable of dismantling an opponent's war economy through systematic destruction of critical industrial nodes. The American approach differed markedly from both German tactical aviation doctrine and British area bombing methods, representing instead a calculated effort to identify and destroy the specific industrial systems that sustained German military capability. This strategy required unprecedented intelligence collection and analysis capabilities, as American planners worked to map the intricate web of industrial relationships that connected raw material extraction through component manufacturing to final assembly of weapons systems. The resulting target lists reflected months of painstaking research into German economic organization, identifying facilities whose destruction would create cascading failures across multiple sectors of war production. The ball bearing industry provided a perfect example of this systematic approach to industrial targeting. American intelligence analysts had determined that German war production depended heavily on a relatively small number of ball-bearing manufacturing facilities, with approximately 60% of production concentrated in the factories around Schweinfurt and Bavaria. Ball bearings were critical components in virtually every mechanical system from aircraft engines to tank transmissions, and their production required specialized machinery and skilled workers that could not be quickly replaced or dispersed. In August and October 1943, American bomber forces mounted major raids against Schweinfurt that demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of precision strategic bombing. The August raid involved 230 B-17 bombers attacking in broad daylight without fighter escort for the final leg of the mission, facing concentrated German fighter opposition that shot down 36 bombers and damaged 122 others. The October raid proved even more costly, with 60 bombers lost out of 291 dispatched, representing casualty rates approaching 20% that would have been unsustainable for any extended period. Yet despite these losses, the raids achieved significant damage to Schweinfurt production facilities, reducing ball-bearing output by approximately 38% and creating shortages that rippled through German armaments production for months afterward. The Schweinfurt raids forced both American and German forces to reconsider their respective strategies and capabilities. American commanders recognized that unescorted daylight bombing raids against heavily defended targets produced casualties that exhausted even their substantial replacement pools, leading to temporary suspension of deep penetration missions until long-range escort fighters could be deployed in sufficient numbers. German defenders, meanwhile, discovered that even successful interceptions that inflicted heavy losses on attacking forces could not prevent significant damage to critical facilities when American bombers pressed home their attacks with determination. The willingness of American crews to continue missions despite heavy losses shocked German fighter pilots accustomed to opponents who would break off attacks when faced with determined resistance. This aggressive operational style reflected both the quality of American aircrew training and the broader cultural factors that shaped American military effectiveness, including emphasis on mission accomplishment over preservation of individual units and confidence in the industrial system's ability to replace losses regardless of their scale. The introduction of P-51 Mustang fighters in large numbers during early 1944 fundamentally altered the strategic bombing campaign by providing American bombers with escort protection all the way to targets deep inside Germany. The P-51 combined exceptional range with performance characteristics that matched or exceeded German fighters, creating a tactical situation where Luftwaffe interceptors faced fighter opposition before reaching bomber formations. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to relatively free attacks on bomber formations now found themselves engaged by aggressive American fighters that sought combat rather than merely defending bombers. This tactical shift forced Luftwaffe commanders to develop new interception methods emphasizing mass formations and coordinated attacks, but these adaptations consumed fuel and training resources at unsustainable rates while American escort strength continued growing month by month. By spring 1944, typical American bombing missions included 700 to 1,000 heavy bombers escorted by 400 to 600 fighters, creating aerial armadas that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer mass regardless of tactical sophistication. The expansion of target sets through 1944 demonstrated the breadth of American bombing capabilities as operations extended beyond military-industrial facilities to include transportation infrastructure, communications networks, and urban areas housing war workers. The systematic destruction of German railroad systems beginning in spring 1944 proved particularly devastating, as American and British bombers attacked marshalling yards, bridges, and locomotive repair facilities with such intensity that German railway traffic declined by approximately 50% between March and September 1944. This transportation paralysis created cascading effects across the entire German war economy as coal shipments from the Ruhr Valley declined, forcing factories to reduce operations despite having adequate labor and machinery. Raw materials accumulated at mines and ports while finished weapons sat in factories awaiting transportation to frontline units. Food distribution to cities became increasingly erratic, forcing implementation of emergency measures that diverted trucks and fuel from military use to prevent urban starvation. The psychological impact of this systematic transportation destruction extended beyond immediate economic effects as German civilians and military personnel alike recognized that their country's infrastructure was being methodically dismantled regardless of battlefield outcomes. The bombing of German cities evolved from a secondary effect of military-industrial targeting into a deliberate component of strategic bombing doctrine as American forces adopted elements of British area bombing methods. While official American policy continued emphasizing precision attacks on military targets, operational realities including weather conditions, navigation errors, and defensive pressures meant that many raids achieved results indistinguishable from area bombing. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 demonstrated the devastating potential of coordinated incendiary attacks against urban areas, as American and British bombers created firestorms that killed an estimated 25,000 civilians and destroyed approximately 13 square miles of the medieval city center. Similar raids against Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, and dozens of smaller cities produced cumulative destruction that left approximately 3.6 million Germans homeless by war's end, while killing between 350,000 and 500,000 civilians depending on varying casualty estimates. The strategic value of these urban attacks remained controversial even within Allied command structures, with some planners arguing that destruction of housing and civilian morale justified the resources committed, while critics maintained that the same effort directed against specific military economic targets would have produced greater impact on German war capability. German civil defense organizations struggled desperately to mitigate bombing effects through expanded shelter construction, improved firefighting capabilities, and systematic evacuation of non-essential populations from threatened cities. These efforts achieved some success in reducing casualties from individual raids, as German cities developed sophisticated early warning systems and shelter networks that allowed civilians to seek protection when bomber formations approached. The effectiveness of these protective measures varied considerably depending on local leadership quality and resource availability, with some cities like Hamburg developing highly effective civil defense systems while others remained dangerously unprepared despite repeated attacks. The psychological strain of sustained bombing fell particularly heavily on children and elderly residents who lacked the physical resilience to endure repeated nights in shelters or the emotional resources to process the constant threat of violent death. Reports from German social workers and medical personnel documented rising rates of psychological disorders including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that affected not just bombing survivors but entire communities living under the constant threat of air attack. The industrial impact of sustained bombing extended beyond direct destruction of facilities to include indirect effects that proved equally damaging to German war production. Workers who spent nights in shelters arrived at factories exhausted and unable to maintain production rates, while constant disruption of utilities like electricity and water made sustained manufacturing operations increasingly difficult even in undamaged facilities. The psychological burden of bombing affected worker morale and discipline, with absenteeism rates climbing and production quality declining as workers struggled with fear, exhaustion, and growing recognition that Germany was losing the war. Management personnel found themselves spending increasing amounts of time on air raid preparation, damage repair, and worker welfare issues rather than production optimization, creating organizational inefficiencies that compounded the direct effects of physical destruction. The cumulative result was a steady erosion of German industrial effectiveness that manifested as declining production per worker hour even in sectors where physical plant capacity remained largely intact. The German aircraft industry suffered particularly severe disruption from American bombing despite elaborate efforts at dispersal and protection. Major assembly plants were relocated from vulnerable urban locations to underground facilities, caves, and forests where they would be harder to detect and attack. Component manufacturing was dispersed across hundreds of smaller facilities to reduce vulnerability to individual raids. These defensive measures succeeded in preventing complete destruction of German aircraft production, but they imposed enormous costs in terms of transportation overhead, coordination difficulties, and reduced productivity that more than offset the protection they provided. Aircraft that once required 5,000 man-hours to assemble in a centralized factory now consumed 8,000 hours when built in dispersed facilities with improvised tooling and untrained workers. Quality control became nearly impossible to maintain when component production was scattered across dozens of sites, leading to increased defect rates and reduced operational reliability that compounded the difficulties facing Luftwaffe maintenance personnel. The net result was that German aircraft production, while never completely halted, functioned at a fraction of its potential efficiency while consuming far more resources than it should have required. The aluminum shortage created by bombing of hydroelectric facilities and aluminum smelters forced German aircraft designers to incorporate increasing amounts of steel and wood into airframe construction, producing aircraft that were heavier and less capable than their predecessors despite nominal performance specifications. The Heinkel He-162 jet fighter, rushed into production during the war's final months, exemplified this desperation as designers struggled to create an effective combat aircraft using non-strategic materials that could be manufactured by semi-skilled workers in dispersed facilities. The E-162 combined a jet engine with a largely wooden airframe held together with adhesive that frequently failed under operational stresses, producing an aircraft that was as dangerous to its pilots as to enemy forces. The fact that German industry devoted substantial resources to producing such improvised designs demonstrated the extent to which sustained bombing had degraded German manufacturing capabilities and forced acceptance of standards that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The cumulative tonnage of American bombing reached levels that German civil and military authorities found almost impossible to comprehend as they attempted to calculate the resources devoted to attacking their homeland. The 2.7 million tons of bombs dropped by American forces alone, excluding entirely the substantial British contribution, exceeded the total explosive yield of all munitions expended by all combatants during World War I. This comparison provided context that helped explain why German cities resembled lunar landscapes and why industrial production had collapsed despite frantic efforts at repair and reconstruction. Each ton of bombs required not just the explosives themselves but also the aircraft to carry them, the fuel to power those aircraft, the crews to fly them, and the entire logistical infrastructure to support sustained operations across an ocean. The scale of this industrial and organizational achievement represented a revolution in military affairs as profound as any tactical or technological innovation, demonstrating that modern industrial states could project destructive power across continental distances at intensities that would have seemed fantastical to military planners of previous generations. The failure of German intelligence to accurately assess American bombing capabilities stemmed partly from institutional biases that led analysts to discount evidence that contradicted their preferred conclusions. Reports from forward observers, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance all provided data points suggesting American capabilities far exceeded initial estimates, but these data were filtered through analytical frameworks that emphasized German advantages and minimized enemy strengths. The tendency to attribute tactical setbacks to temporary factors or operational errors rather than fundamental capability gaps meant that German assessments consistently lagged behind battlefield realities, creating a widening disconnect between official intelligence estimates and actual combat experiences. Field commanders who reported being overwhelmed by American air power were sometimes accused of defeatism or incompetence rather than being recognized as accurate observers of an unprecedented military phenomenon. This institutional resistance to accepting uncomfortable truths delayed necessary adaptations and contributed to continued strategic miscalculations that worsened Germany's position. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.